that's based on some of the papers. And really, for those of you who don't know about WAF and the history of WAF, fundamentalism as in any kind of religious extremism, and it was, the group was founded, when was it founded?
1989,
at
the Russian Affair.
Yes. Yeah. A group of, I believe, largely London-based feminist activists of all religious backgrounds, and they have played a very, or we, I should say, have played a very important role in terms of discussions around religious fundamentalism, extremism on the one hand, but also racism, Islamophobia on the other. So I'm not going to take too much time because I really just want to welcome you and hand over to my colleague Nira, who is going to chair, because I'm going to be one of the speakers. So welcome.
Thank you very much, Nadia. And it is been a joy, and we've had some very, very interesting papers, and the special issue we are editing is for the journal Feminist Dissent, in which quite a few of women have been involved in Women Against Fundamentalism are involved. Sukhwal Dalwal and myself also edited a book that came out in 2014 in Lawrence and Wishart called Women Against Fundamentalism, Stories of Dissent and Solidarity, in which the life stories individually and WAF collectively are being presented, and there are several women here who have had chapters in this book, so I recommend it. But today we are going to talk about gender fundamentalism and recent developments in the Middle East. These are, as you hear, amazing women who have been both scholars and activists in that area. But in a way, we shouldn't talk about it as there, because there and here, as I'm sure will come out in the discussion, if not in the presentation, are intimately interwoven. And we're going to lead the discussion today as we do every seminar, which we have been holding once a semester. And at the beginning, we have 4 amazing presentations, and each of them will exercise a discipline not to talk more than 20 minutes, and I'm going to remind them 5 minutes before they have to stop. After this, between the different presentations, I would like you to ask questions only if you have issues of understanding, not in terms of comments, but in terms of clarification. After the 4th presentation, we are going to have a break where Nadia is going to send you where you can get tea or coffee for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes. And then we hopefully will have up to an hour discussions in which all of you are being invited not only to ask questions, but also make comments, to present challenges, to talk to each other and to the women in the panel. You can direct it to a particular presentation, or you can make general comments. And also, this space of time will enable the different presenters also to comment about each other's paper. So the speakers are going to be in the order of the programs that obviously you've all seen, and I'm also not going to go into details of the autobiographical notes of all of them, because it again has been in the leaflet. So the first speaker is going to be Nazan Beghani, who is going to talk about media, gender and honor, the cyber representation of women in Iraqi Kurdistan. The second one is going to be Ruba Maisen, Gender and Religious Extremism in Syria, Women Lead an Ongoing Fight for Freedom. The third one is by Zahara Ali, who is going to speak about women's political activism in post-invasion Iraq, Muslim feminists, Islamist women, and the women between. And the last but not least is going to be Nadia Al-Ali, who is going to speak beyond ISIS, gender-based violence, militarism, and authoritarianism. So So I'm very much looking forward to hearing. We are going to video most of the presentations. We've asked permission from the speakers. We would like also to video the general discussion after the break, but if any of you would rather not be videoed, please contact Georgie, who is also our sister, both from Women Against Fundamentalism and now from the Center of Migration, Refugees and Belonging in University of East London, where I work. And the video presentation of all the seminars afterwards are put on the websites of the two centers. So let us know in the break if you have problems about the general discussion. Okay, Nazan, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Great to see you. So I will wait when it is 5 minutes.
Yeah, I want to be on my time. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Nira and Nadia, for inviting me to address this seminar. It's such a beautiful day. We are talking about violence against women. As Nira said, my paper is about gender on media, more particularly cyber violence against women in Kurdish communities, especially in Iraqi Kurdistan. This is a piece of research, qualitative research that I conducted with colleagues from the University of Suleiman in Iraqi Kurdistan, and we used a variety of methods. Just quickly mentioning them, because we've been working in a very sensitive area. Approvals were very important to us, as well as risk and equality policies, as stipulated by the University of Bristol. We also did a literature review and monitored a number of cyber media and other Kurdish networks, including blogs, YouTubes, Facebooks, women's publications, mainstream newspapers, TV networks, and all their respective websites. We also conducted a variety of in-depth consultations, round-table meetings, focus groups with different people working on these issues in Iraqi Kurdistan, including media professionals, editors, journalists, also women's rights activists, government officials, and those who work in shelters and special directorates to combat violence against women. Overall, we conducted 64 semi-structured interviews and also some case studies. We interviewed 12 victims of cyber violence in the course of our research. The aims, I mean, this is a new type of violence in Iraqi Kurdistan, I think everywhere, but in that part of the world, it's manifested itself very strongly. And our aims of this research were to identify women's experience of cyber violence, to assess the impact of these kinds of violence on women's lives, to examine the relationship of cyber violence to depressive symptoms among girls and women in Kurdistan, because we've had, you may have heard about suicides and self-immolation among Kurdish women in Kurdistan, especially in Iraqi Kurdistan, and one of our aims is to find a link between these types of violence and depressive symptoms. We also aimed to examine the profile of abusers and violent actors, exploring ways to raise awareness among policymakers, legislators, frontline practitioners, and of course in general public. Identifying prevention and protection measures to help women, supporting them to rebuild their lives, and after all, our aims one of our aims is to provide robust fact-based data and with some recommendations to decision makers in Iraqi Kurdistan. Just quickly, I'd like to define the cyber media as it was reflected to us during our fieldwork. It includes all kinds of internet and cyberspace publications, including media websites, blogs, social media, and YouTube. They have a strong capacity to inform and allow for debate and deliberation. They play a very important part in the process of cultural, ideological, and opinion formation. They transform the life of individuals in Kurdistan, as well as communication and interaction between people. And they have a double-sided effect on women's life. I highlighted this in red because I'd like to give you a quick idea about the media environment in Iraqi Kurdistan. It's a very difficult environment. Media lack the independence. They serve as transmission belt for political parties and their agenda. There is little space devoted to societal and women's issues. Women's publications started to challenge the mainstream media, and through that, violence against women and more particularly honor-based violence have been covered both in women's publications and some so-called independent mainstream media. So the double-sided effect for women, sorry for some mistakes, I did that in training, sorry. Space, they have a very strong impact on women's life. They provided a space to reach out and provided them a new mode of interaction and communication through the internet, through the cyber interaction. Women have been able to go beyond their immediate location. They've been able to communicate with the outside world and involve in international debates and actions, and to break the cycle of violence and get their voices heard. But at the same time, cyber violence has placed women in the face of new challenges, which are based on some structural violence in Kurdish societies, including the honor-based violence. They've been using the code of honor. So the cyber violence can be described as any kind of written, verbal, visual behavior, mainly private, anonymous actors, intentionally targeting women, exposing private life of women with the aim to dishonoring them, social shaming, ostracism, stalking, and also practicing mutual threat, emotional abuse, and coercion. What does the game consist of? According to our fieldwork, the actors behind these kinds of violence have been publishing and circulating dishonorable and fabricated pictures, I put this between quotation marks, of pictures, footage of women through internet, Facebook, and mobile phones. They've been writing and posting defamatory reports and articles about women, hacking their personal Facebook and email accounts, and publicizing their private data and sending threatening messages, intimidating them. And these acts have been premeditated with no legal pursuit that I mention later. The media and cyber media have reproduced a kind of structural violence through these kinds of actions. They created anonymous actors playing around honor and dishonor equation, contributed to the circulation of rumor and a strong appetite for gossip and desire to touch upon the reputation of women and dishonoring them. Also, women have been faced with brutal threat, emotional abuse, and coercion. Gossip and rumor affect very badly the lives and reputation of women and their families. They put them under a lot of pressure. The women found themselves in the face of new challenges because these kinds of behavior have exposed women's privacy and sexuality. The actions contributing to credibility and public standing of women led to permanent dishonor and disgrace. and ended in isolations. We have some cases of suicide and murder. And well-known females, I should have said that many well-known figures in Kurdish communities have been targeted by these kinds of violence. They've been dishonored, and their public standing very much based on their credibility and their image in public. The ultimate aims of these actors are to exercise power, to place women under a system of control, surveillance, and attack and extreme fear, to impede women's full participation in online activities and silencing them, and also to practice a kind of what I call demagogy politics. So they incite public emotion and outrage against the outstanding women, and through that excluding them from the public arena, and undermine their dignity and well-being. Symbolically, many of these women have just been killed. They've been totally silenced because seemingly plausible accounts in public domain put their life into danger, and especially they've been dishonored. So honor-based violence has been practiced against many of these women. Some statistics. Between January and August 2015, we looked at the cases of 127 women subjected to violence only in the city of Soleimani. 61 of these women were subjected to cyber violence, and their age varied, but they are mainly between 19 to 26 years old. 51 of them are married. 82 have limited education, so they, vulnerable women have been targeted here. They don't work. They are restricted into their private space and mainly housekeepers. The majority of them live in cities, and mobile phones and Facebook have been used as means to practice such violence. Consequently, the majority of them have been exposed to physical violence by the family members. There have been some responses so far. The governmental response, in May 2008, the government took a law, number 6, which addresses the defamation and bad use of all means of modern communications. It criminalizes misuse of communication means, which leads to dishonoring and violating the private life of individuals. Article 1 of the law stipulates that telephone, postal, and other electronic communications fall in the field of private affairs should not be violated. They called on companies running these means of communications to regulate their systems with the aim to approve anonymity. And when you look at the law, it looks very progressive, but according to our fieldwork, it has not been effectively implemented. There have been also some responses from the civil society group. Am I okay, Mira?
Another 7 minutes.
7 minutes. Okay, yeah. I'll be done by 7 minutes. Women's rights groups have responded to that kind of violence through campaigns, debates, and conferences, and also through their own media. I don't have time to mention, but we have about 10 media outlets run by women, different women's groups and women's organizations. There have been also some petitions. The most recent one was in December 2015, sorry, not 16. In these petitions, well-known activists and academics call on public opinion to stand against these kinds of violence, and they through the petition also there has been some public awareness. In conclusion, I would like to say that media in Kurdistan is a crucial role in perpetuating traditional norms and values. It has not been able to generate a culture of rational debate, to help to form a public opinion challenging traditional gender norms, missed the opportunity to address human rights of women. The media, especially so-called independent media channels, they do talk a lot about human rights, but women's rights often are not included in the category of human rights. The cyber media has been used for gossip and circulation of rumors, stalking threats leading to dishonoring women and putting them under a lot of pressure and danger of honor-based violence. There have been some responses, and the government response we found has not been focused. Their latest policy and legislative developments fail to tackle effectively these issues and any kinds of new form of violence against women. And finally, in conclusion, I'd like to quote a media expert, Hiwa Osman, who said in 2010 that an wholesome atmosphere in which the Kurdish media operates makes it easy for people to just defame, insult, or praise others with complete disregard to any code of ethics or professional standards. Thank you very much.
Are there any immediate questions or clarification for Nazar? Yes.
Yeah, I would like to clarify a point. Is there a relationship between attackers and victims? Do they know the victims personally or just come by chance?
Most of the actors are private, anonymous, and it's been very difficult to know who are behind these anonymous actors. But we have also some cases of people who are related to the women, the victims.
Who is the attacker? Is usually man or woman and man?
It's a very good question, because there are mainly men, but unfortunately we found out that some women have been also behind that.
Because Ceren Begi's research in Turkish Kurdistan, which is she did amazing fieldwork research there, and my research in diaspora actually point out most of honor-based crimes actually leading by the old female member of the families as a protection of the honor.
But would they do it in a way of cyber? I think we will continue this discussion because these are very important issues later on. But, and it's also interesting in kind of comparative context. However, now I would like to invite Ruba to give her presentation. And where is that? Oh.
I'm here. I'm so tall that it was
underground.
Okay, so I'm very glad to be here. So just to give a precision, what I'm going to present is not actually what you have in the flyer, because previously I thought it would be like a closed research seminar, and I wanted to discuss the divisions and issues between, Islamist women activists, Muslim feminists, etc. What I'm going to present, because then I was told it was, directed to a wider audience. So what I'm going to present is more an overview of what is going on in terms of, gender issues and issues of fundamentalism in Arab Iraq. I'm not going to talk about Kurdistan. So it is based on my doctoral research that proposes first a study of women's social, economic and political experiences and gender issues and politics in Iraq since the formation of the modern state. And I have done an ethnography conducted inside Iraqi women political groups and organizations. So I have stayed mainly in Baghdad between October 2010 and June 2012. But I have conducted also fieldwork in Iraqi Kurdistan, in Erbil and Semaniya, but I'm not going to talk about it for this presentation. And more recently, just 3 years ago, I have been in Iraq and carried on my fieldwork research, but also expanded it to civil society activism as a whole.
I have investigated a movement that is bringing a lot of hope at the moment, despite the overall terrible situation, a movement against corruption and sectarianism that started in Tahrir Square in Baghdad and expanded all over Iraq. It started in July 2015. And so I conducted fieldwork among this movement, both in Baghdad and Najaf. For the first time I've been conducting fieldwork in Najaf. So if I don't have the time to go back to that because of the time limit, I would love to answer questions about it because it's closely related to women's rights issues and not really or not at all covered by the media. So just a little remark about the use of the word fundamentalism, which is a word that I rarely use in my writings about the Iraqi context and more generally really. Because basically it is used so much in the media and even in some scholarship in relation to Islam or Islamist political groups in a way that I fundamentally disagree with. So often it is used as if it was the cause and the consequence of women's rights violation in Muslim-majority countries. It's like it explains itself by itself. Women are oppressed by Islamic fundamentalism because Islamic fundamentalism is oppressive towards women. So once we have said that, I'm not sure we have resolved or understood anything at all. First, because we have reduced to one explanatory factor a complex and multi-layered reality and approach it through an essentialist lens. Secondly, because we talk about a way of reading religion or the use of religion by individuals or groups as if it could exist outside the human beings who claim it and also outside of its context. So often when we hear the way it is dealt with, Islamic fundamentalism exists outside of its realities, like an essence that navigates across borders, people and cultures. So I'm happy that we are today going to have the opportunity to use it in a way that brings complexity and that we are all situating and contextualizing what we're talking about. So I do not approach religion itself through an essentialist perspective. I do not approach religion as if it existed outside the human beings that practice it, read it and interpret it. And even more importantly, I consider it in its context, paying attention to the multiplicity of elements that characterize its different contexts of expression and development. So, because instead of falling into a discussion involving religion and the different ways in which gender issues are dealt with in the various religious groups, institutions and movements, ideologies that exist and has always existed since perhaps the prophetic age, we should ask ourselves why a specific reading, conservative or progressive, more or less patriarchal, was privileged at a particular time and context. In a way, it is saying, within Muslim-majority context, different understanding and approaches regarding gender matters have always existed, from the most liberal and progressive to the most regressive and oppressive. But why does a specific reading is privileged by a specific group or becomes hegemonic at a specific socio-historical moment? So in my research, I propose to explore Iraqi women's life, rights and activism through a complex analysis that looks at the imbrication not only of gender and religion, but also at the way gender issues are imbricated with issues of nationhood, state politics and ideologies, as well as with Islam in its different and various readings and practices. So just to take a brief historical overview here and start with the post-colonial period, the period of the independence and of what is called the revolutionary times in Iraq, following the establishment of the first Iraqi Republic in 1958, was a period of a certain national unity when the political culture was dominated by the left and the anti-imperialist political forces. There was the emergence of a urban middle class. All that contributed to minimize the significance of sectarian, ethnic and religious divisions. It is during that period that women's activists were integrated to the process, for the first time, of the formulation of women's legal rights through the establishment of the personal status code, which is a legal frame concerning marriage, inheritance, divorce, etc. So basically gathering most of women's legal rights. Women gained essential rights at this period, especially the most radical and symbolic one, which was equal shares in inheritance, perceived at the time as a direct questioning of the power of the religious authorities. So the personal status code that was elaborated in this period, that is often considered as the golden age of women's political activism in Iraq, was one of the most progressive codes in the region. So it was the produce of a negotiation between Sunni and Shia authorities at the time, religious authorities, women's rights activists, and the new state. So interestingly, the reading of Islam that was favored at the time was a quite progressive reading, and a reading that brought together Sunni and Shia jurisprudence. The context of the time was characterized by strong secularization, and the new revolutionary state was promoting a modernist kind of nationalist gender discourse that claimed to be culturally authentic in setting a code inspired by the so-called Sharia. So this period was really short, as the first Ba'ath coup in 1963 put an end to this revolutionary atmosphere. And quickly about the Ba'ath period, I can say that the patrimonial and very harsh authoritarianism, doubled by a rentier economy state, impacted on gender norms and relation. I cannot develop too much, but I can say that women's rights and concrete realities of life began to deteriorate in the 80s with the war with Iran, the militarization of the society, and the economic crisis that followed. And that sectarianism was exacerbated by the regime's violent political repression, especially in the 80s and 90s. So the very final blow given to Iraq was the US-led coalition bombing of '91 and the humanitarian crisis provoked by the sanctions, plunging the middle class into poverty, destroying the public health, social and education system on which women relied heavily. A research conducted by Yasmin Jawahari on the gender impact on the sanctions, and Nadia's research show how much it created new forms of patriarchy, reinforcing normative gender relations, and even impacted on moral, sexual and social values. So the same regime of Saddam Hussein that in the 70s reformed the personal status code in, let's say, progressive terms, although talking about state feminism in the authoritarian frame is very problematic, and we can go back to that. But in the context following the sanction, the regime turned into a so-called Islamic tribal gender discourse, aligning itself with the rise of Islamist movement in the region, but also in a situation where it could not rely anymore on the wealth of the oil to extend its power and could not provide for its society as it used to anymore. So relying on the re-emergence of tribalism provoked by the sanction and using a religious kind of discourse through what's called al-Hamla al-Imaniya, the faith campaign, was a way to reassert its power. So at the time, very conservative measures were implemented, such as the imposition of a mahram, a male relative to women in their travel, and the personal status code was again reformed in a line of a more conservative and normative reading of women's legal rights. So the situation that characterized Iraq in 2003 was rise of religious and social conservatism, generalized impoverishment, sectarian tensions, and the militarization of a society living since at least the 80s in constant war. All these dimensions carried very concrete impact on gender norms and practices. So the invasion and occupation of Iraq by the US-led forces exacerbated this reality in 2003. So I will just evoke a few points. So the first, I mean, Nadia, she has evoked it a lot in her work and in her book, What Kind of Liberation? So the fact that the administration, the US administration used a very colonial gender saving Iraqi woman rhetoric. So in post-invasion Iraq, gender issues became politicized in a context where armed interventions are used for imperialist agendas under the name of a so-called democratization, and the increase of conservatism, especially related to gender issues, can be seen as a backlash against neocolonial politics and a reaction to the occupation itself. A reaction expressed in so-called Islamic terms to oppose to what is perceived as a Western invasion. The second point is the link between gender norms and relation and the overall situation of violence. So the militarization of the Iraqi society and the issue of violence, since both the authoritarian nature of the Iraqi regime and the beginning of the military conflict since the 80s had a great impact in gender representations and relations. And since 2003, and even more after the civil war that we experienced in 2006 and 2007, the militarization of Iraqi public spaces that is very obvious, like in Baghdad. It has turned Baghdad to a city of men. You have checkpoints, T-walls, soldiers in the streets everywhere. Many places are now not accessible to women. Even in neighborhoods that, like after, for example, 5 p.m., even in neighborhoods that are considered pretty mixed and open. And this is a very important dimension that has an impact on gender representations and practices, and on the concrete reality of women's lives and activism. So now the celebration of the figure of the soldier protecting the nation is even more present since the invasion of Daesh in June 2014, when Daesh entered Mosul. Because there was the launch of Al-Hashd al-Sha'bi, which is an army composed of Iraqi citizens who volunteered after the declaration of Ayatollah Sistani to go and fight to defend Iraq's territory. And really in Baghdad especially, you feel it everywhere. The public sphere is dominated by men, and not any men. The armed young men, and it's a culture of war in which women and women's so-called honor are considered as objects to protect and preserve. So the issue of violence is really central to understand the rise of social and religious conservatism, and the way in which both sectarianism and tribalism have evolved within the society, in the sense that within a situation of exacerbated violence, when the state cannot provide security or is partly the producer of violence, the society relies on alternative means of protection. Third point, the issue of sectarianism and its link with gender issues. Something that is very central is to understand when dealing with the current context is the institutionalization of communal-based identities imposed by the US-led administration. So the post-invasion Iraqi system is based on sectarian and ethnic divisions. The US-led invasion has not only brought very conservative Islamist political groups to power, but it also brought groups whose political power relied on the sectarian division. So we see straight away the impact of sectarianism on women and gender matters through against the way the personal status code was addressed in post-invasion Iraq. In 2003, straight after the invasion, several propositions were made by conservative Shia Islamist parties in the form of the Decree 137 and then the Article 41 of the Constitution. Basically, it consisted in abolishing the Unified Personal Status Code, established in 1959, and setting up at its place a new law based on communal identity. As a result, the Personal Status Code would be transformed into a set of sectarian-based codes in the model of the Lebanese family law. So very concretely, it means to go back to the situation that characterized the monarchic period, when no set of law regarding private matters unified Iraqis. So there was a lot of mobilization. More recently, there was a draft law called the Ja'fari law in the name of the Ja'fari madhab, which is the main Shia madhab in Iraq. And there was a campaign launched by women's rights activists and civil society activists against the sectarian personal status code. Since 2014, the invasion of Daesh has exacerbated even more sectarian tensions because it justified the state of emergency and it justified the sectarian central government discourse, emphasizing the fact that the Shia identity is actually threatened, and so that it needs to be reinforced and promoted. So now not only the society but also the territory is fragmented according to sectarian lines. And the final point, so in addition to its sectarian nature, the weakness and corrupted nature of the new regime is very important to take into account here. Until now, the very weakness of the Iraqi state's institution and its failure to guarantee basic public services oblige most of women's groups and organizations to rely on international funds, even for dealing with very basic issues such as helping families to have access to running water and electricity. Even women's representatives prefer relying on NGOs funds rather than on the public funds. First, because of the very corrupted nature of the state's institution, and secondly, because of its sectarian functioning. In this context, Iraqi women activists are acting as substitute to a very weak state, not able to provide security, basic human rights. Women's rights activists have been very vocal in asking for healthcare allowance for widows, orphanage, and also mobilizing in movements such as the current popular movements that denounces corruption and sectarianism. And one of the banniers held by demonstrators, just like in Tahrir Square, like 3 weeks ago when I was there, was Daesh is the produce of the corruption and sectarianism of the new Iraqi regime. So, and I mean, it's very true because in Iraq, Daesh is composed mainly of Iraqi Sunnis and not of foreign fighters. It's a very different context. In Syria, it's 80% foreign fighters. In Iraq, Daesh is composed of Iraqis. It shows very clearly that like the tribal leaders and former Ba'athists who joined it considered the Iraqi army in al-Mosul as a Shia army, and the central government as a very discriminatory towards the Sunni population. Also, another point, most of the soldiers of the Iraqi army supposed to be in al-Mosul at the time when Daesh entered Mosul were not holding their position. The corrupted military system in Iraq allows many soldiers to receive their salary while not being physically in the army. So yes, like the men and women of Tahrir Square, I would also say that Daesh's presence, not existence, but presence in Iraq is the produce of the corruption and sectarianism characterizing the post-invasion regime. And I will stop here.
Overview. Are there any clarification questions at this stage? I don't think anybody is raising. Are you? Okay. No. Yeah. Okay. That's right. Okay. So what we're going to do now is to move to the final speakers before the break. Nadia, the floor is yours.
Okay, so Zahra has already provided such a rich and in-depth empirical and analytical sort of overview of Iraq. So I'm not going to go over that, but I'm going to take as a starting point Iraq and gender-based violence in Iraq, to share with you my reflections and my dilemmas, both academic and political, in trying to think and talking, how do we talk about gender-based violence in Iraq? And then the second part of my paper, I will move to my more recent current work, which I'm undertaking with my co-researcher, Dr. Latif Tash, which is on the Kurdish political movement, or more specifically the Turkish-Kurdish conflict and the specific intersections of women's rights activism and peace activism. And sort of the overall concepts that I'm reflecting on is gender-based violence, militarism, and authoritarianism. So when I've been working on Iraq for a long time, and the main impetus for a long time, especially after the invasion of 2003, was really for me to challenge this widespread popular media and policy discourse about, well, you know, this is just another Muslim country oppressing its women, and we understand gender-based violence and discrimination and inequality by reference to their culture. And of course, their culture was often conflated with their religion. And in that context, Muslim, Iraqi, Middle Eastern, Arab, Kurdish became conflated. So I spent quite a bit of time and energy, political and academic investment, and quite a bit, I should say, with my co-researcher and author, Dr. Nicola Pratt, who's at the University of Warwick, and we've worked together for a long time, really challenging this idea of this, what we call culturalization discourse, and very much trying to reveal that we need to look at imperialist policies, neoliberal policies, but also regional factors, and more concretely with respect to the Iraqi context, really challenging the idea not only that gender-based violence is inherent in Iraqi culture, but that violence increased post-invasion. But in the same vein, we also very much challenge this idea that sectarianism was very much inherent in Iraqi culture. There was sort of one of the theories that was promoted by some colleagues, academic colleagues, and in the media was that, you know, Iraq was an artificial state, and that sectarianism was you know, that was really the fabric of Iraqi society. I mean, I never bought the argument that sectarianism started after the invasion. I thought that was also very naive. That was kind of the narrative of my father, the older generation, who, when they grew up in the 40s and 50s in Baghdad, in middle-class neighborhoods, they didn't know whether their neighbors were Sunni, Shia, or they were Arab or Kurd or Christian, and they were all living happily together, and they were intermarrying. That might have been the case for urban middle-class Iraqis, but that was not the case for everyone. And certainly sectarianism, sectarian sentiments and discrimination based on either sectarian or ethnic, certainly the Kurdish Arab conflict and tensions and forms of discriminations were very real. And Saddam Hussein very much played on them as well. But they were not as institutionalized, and certainly I hold the invasion and the occupation responsible for institutionalizing and really intensifying them. But sort of to move back to the whole issue of gender-based violence, I then sort of I think I started to feel a sense of discomfort in terms of my own attitude and positionality vis-a-vis the issue of gender-based violence and how we frame it, and it sort of came out in different contexts. So, for example, when Mona El-Tahawi, I think it's now 3 years ago, wrote this infamous article, maybe some of you have seen it, Why Do They Hate Us? And so Mona El-Tahawi is an Egyptian-American feminist journalist, and she became quite well known in the context of the protest in Egypt. She was beaten up, she had both of her arms broken, she wrote quite a bit about this incident. And so she wrote this article that gave us the impression that Middle Eastern men as a category hate Middle Eastern women as a category. And the whole article was, I'm sort of simplifying things, but the whole article was also packaged. It was, I think, Foreign Affairs, the journal, the magazine of Foreign Affairs, a veiled woman. So it was a kind of classic packaging that really created quite a controversy, and many of us reacted to it. But I have to say I also felt uncomfortable with the reaction to it. Because I felt that many of my colleagues, particularly my colleagues based, I should say, in the United States, when they reacted to it, totally dismissed the possibility that there are issues in relation to patriarchal culture, tradition, you name it, I mean, that are problematic. I mean, the whole discussion was about, well, it's imperialism, it's neoliberalism, it's capitalism, it's out there. That out there is to blame for any kind of forms of discrimination and inequalities. And I didn't feel comfortable about that. I thought, you know, we really need to have a much more nuanced and complex discussion. Clearly, we cannot explain away I mean, still I felt, you know, that the packaging, the culture, religion, and they, men, as a category was hugely problematic, as a women as a category. But I do think that this very dichotomous approach, this very sort of binarized approach that we find, I've been more recently writing against it. And I should say that I was really helped in thinking through this by my MA students. Particularly, I should mention one, Lynn Hashem, who was with us 3 years ago. She was quite a well-known Lebanese feminist and queer activist. And she, you know, would get quite frustrated. I remember once reading Laila Abu Lughut and Do Muslim Women Need Saving? And she said, you know, why these post-colonial feminists, you know, why are they so concerned about, you know, imperialism? And, you know, while doing that, they're really very dismissive and silencing and discrediting local activists. And it really sort of got me thinking. I mean, I'd been thinking about it before, but she really kind of pushed me further. And so, you know, this dichotomy, which really is a false dichotomy in terms of, you know, being a post-colonial feminist scholar and being a feminist activist, but there is a tension there. There's a tension there that, you know, some local activists do feel that there is a trend within scholarship that is, you know, that is really very much addressing local. So local in the United States is US imperialist, or in Britain it's British imperialist and racist and Islamophobic discourses, challenging those discourses, but in that context not really engaging with regional or local practices and discourses. And in some ways, although it's supposed to be the super progressive politics, it is actually saying, well, you don't have any agency because you are just victims of this sort of big imperialist conspiracy. So that's, I recently published an article in the European Journal of Women's Studies, which was called Sexual Violence in Iraq, Challenges for Transnational Feminist Politics, in which I'm sort of articulating this argument. And I'm also, engaging with the instrumentalization of sexual violence. So when, Zahra made the point very clearly, yes, of course, and actually, of course, Ruba did in the context of Syria. ISIS, IS, Daesh are horrible, and no one should engage in any kind of apologetic. I have to say, I've recently been to a conference in the United States, and some of you have already heard me moaning about this. And so again, we had the situation where the keynote speaker, who thought that he was so cutting edge and progressive and trying to challenge US media discourse and policy discourse, presented this talk in which he gave this. He started out describing a tango movement and then Tai Chi and how to slaughter a sheep, and this is how ISIS decapitate their victims. And then in the next sentence say, and special forces, Western forces get the same training, and we can't beat them, so let's negotiate with them. And and this was really so the whole intention was to provoke, to provoke the US audience, and I should say it's actually someone from this university, but I'm not going to mention any names. Yeah. Anyway, so this was. So what I'm saying is, okay, I'm definitely not in the business of being apologetic for Daesh or IS. But when we look at what's happening in Syria, or when we look at what is happening in Iraq, ISIS or Daesh are not the only source and perpetrators of gender-based violence or any other form of violence. And in some contexts, like Syria, they're actually not the main source of violence. And in the context of Iraq, I don't know if you had the same encounters or exchanges. I know that some of our colleagues in Iraq are very, very frustrated by the fact that no one speaks about the gender-based violence of Shia militia, for example.
Not at all.
No one speaks about it. It's a total taboo, but it is happening. And in some ways, of course, that specific violence also creates, as Zahra pointed out, has created the strength of ISIS, the local support of ISIS among some. We have to also be careful, not every Arab Sunni in Iraq is a ISIS supporter. So one of the points that I then put forward in my article is that it is really important to historicize. I think there is a kind of what I call a presentism. We're kind of just looking at the present. But aside from the fact that it's important to sort of really look at the range of different sources of gender-based violence, it's important to historicize, and what Zahra did very beautifully. So when I sort of was first writing this article, and I have to say I felt a real sort of sense of depression and frustration, and I was looking to do some research that would be more hopeful. And at the time, we started to get the media reports about Kurdish women fighting ISIS and Daesh in Rojava. And I have to say that as a feminist scholar, I was very much intrigued by what I perceived to be kind of a contradiction. I've learned that militarization, the more militarized society, the greater instances of gender-based violence. And here I was confronted with a political movement that, of course, is rooted in the wider Kurdish political movement, particularly the PKK in northern Kurdistan, where, in terms of gender equality, we were presented with, one of the most radical models that I'm certainly aware of in my lifetime, not just in relation to the Middle East, but more broadly. So for the last, well, I guess a year and a half, I've been looking together with Latif into this a movement, particularly in the context of the Turkish-Kurdish conflict. I don't have much time to speak about it, but while I think both of us have been very much moved by many of the activists, the Kurdish women's rights activists, and certainly, I mean, I've spent now 15 years studying women's rights activists in the region. I don't think I've ever felt as inspired as when talking to the Kurdish activists. But at the same time, I think we also have questions in terms of when you think about authoritarianism. I mean, authoritarianism takes different shapes and forms, and there is also kind of authoritarianism in the sense that there's a sort of one specific ideology that everyone is following. And I have to say that when I first gave a talk here at SOAS, Nira was here. This was shortly after a return from my trip to southeastern Turkey, I mean to northern Kurdistan. One of the points that Nira mentioned at the time, I've been thinking about a lot, and I really think she sort of encapsulated it very well. I think there is a problem if, I think a political movement, however progressive it might be with respect to gender-based equality, but if sexuality is not addressed, I think then we have an issue. And I see that sexuality is kind of bracketed out in the sense that either you have to be asexual, or it's something that's not really fully addressed. And I think sort of long term, I'm kind of skeptical in terms of how it translates outside of course, women fighting, and there are lots of positive things. I don't want to in any way diminish, the amazing achievements, but I also have some questions and skepticism. So I think I just maybe wanted to also just take a minute to mention that since we've started doing the research, of course, a lot has happened in Turkey. It's not anymore a source of optimism or inspiration, and the Kurdish political movement, especially I would say the political party, HDP, has been under incredible attack and is very much threatened. And as you know, our colleagues in Turkey, academic colleagues who have signed a petition asking the government to stop the atrocities against the Kurdish communities and to start engage in peace talks are now under investigation, some have already been imprisoned. So when you think about authoritarianism, I think this, we can have, I think one of the things I wanted to say, and I think Zahra said as well, political authoritarianism, which in my mind is one of the biggest problems with respect to everything, but is a feminist issue. And political authoritarianism cuts across secular and religious constituencies. And I think that's also clear in the Turkish-Kurdish context as it is in Iraq. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nadia. I think this has been an amazing fourth contribution to a very complex but complementary discussions in the region of Syria, Iraq, Kurdistan, Turkey, and there will be a lot of things to discuss after the break. The time now is 3:20, unless anybody has a very, very urgent clarification question to Nadia. Okay, so we will break now
Until?
For about 20 minutes. Can you be here break at 20 to 4? So seminar is a whole. And I think these general things were summarized very well by Nadia's presentation, which was the whole relationship of, the theme of this seminar of gender and fundamentalism in this particular region, in relation to religious and non-religious authoritarianism, fundamentalism, as some have called it, and as well as gender-specific issues of violence. And I think that in relation to that, another overall theme that reigned throughout the presentation is the spaces and the kind of social transformation and social change, especially in terms of gender division of labor or gender relations more generally. So maybe we will collect 2 or 3 questions at a time and then let the members of the panel to respond. But when you respond, if you want to comment also in relation to some of the other presentations, please feel free to do it, because we want to have a dialogue and not just to have each of your presentation separately. So who would like to start? I know being a pioneer is a challenge, but please, because I've heard from several of you that you have some questions. So, okay, you start. Yeah.
I guess it's kind of to Nadia, but it relates to some of the things that Zara said. So I guess from the 3 of those, I got this really important sense about ISIS, Daesh, whatever we call them, that they're not the only source of violence, not the only source of violence against women, and that's being missed out in the media representations. And there's a need to nuance the discussion, definitely. I guess I'm wondering, is there a tension between trying to do that and trying to say similarities of gender-based violence by different perpetrators, different groups, different actors at play? Is there a tension between recognising the similarities or and kind of recognising, is there an exceptionalism in, is there an exception in IS or whatever we call it? Is it something, you know, it's this non-state entity that has tried to make a state with supposedly religious law and is doing that, and it's quite, it has its own bureaucracy, it has its own, you know, engineers, accountants, whatever. It's this bizarre entity that's risen up, and so how do we sort of address what might be something quite exceptional about it with not falling into some of the traps that you've alluded to?
Thank you. An important and quite big question, but and I know you want to respond, but maybe if somebody else had, yeah.
Yeah, the ISIS ideologies these days is putting the gender, the women at the forefront of military gender. So, because in the beginning the women were more or less, their status was staying at home, getting married, their own children, and all these. Recently, there had been statements coming out that the women are joining the military. It's funny difference.
So how to interrelate this kind of issue of gender-based violence with a change in women's roles, including going to the military? It is what you're asking.
Yes, the ISIS,
yeah.
The ideology were the women. Now, the change.
Okay.
Bringing.
Okay, and the third and last question at this stage, yes.
So a question, I'm just thinking what has Nadia said about post-colonialism approach and being sort of logistic in the ways in which they...
Can you speak up, please? I can't hear anything in the back.
Really, sorry.
Why do you want to stand up?
No, I'm just thinking of the idea that Nadia has talked about in relation to post-colonialism or post-colonial theorists who are talking about or who are criticized of being logistic because they are not bringing the national context into the analysis of neoliberal policies or colonialism or etc. But I was also thinking that if colonialism has ever ended from the region. And what we see right now is not an extended of past colonialism. And if we are in any ways not just only not apologistic, but we have to talk about it because it's a complete project from the past until now. Even when there was secular regimes, they were very much linked to colonial power. Like if we talk about Jordan, it's very much until now linked to Britain. If we talk about Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia, Wahhabism has been established by the British, and this is research, very well researched and very well actually examined by so many researchers. So how can we not talk about colonialism when its results up to now is on the ground and with its new ideas, with its new colonial projects in the region? I know this is a dilemma for us. When I came first to study here in SOAS, I was sort of very much engaged with religion, with the states, with etc. But then that was not enough for my analysis. And without linking all of these things together, I couldn't actually do a proper research. So we need to find a way in which we link both activists in the region and academics here. How to find ways in which we find an analysis that would cover the whole picture, not only part of it.
Thank you very much. I think three linked but very important questions. Who would like from the panel to start in terms of response? Okay.
I mean, if you want to. Okay, so let me start with the last one. Okay, precisely. I mean, that's actually what I'm arguing in the article. I mean, I would never suggest that we cannot speak about the colonial or the imperialist or neo-colonial. It is not about that at all. It's precisely, my argument is to move beyond this dichotomous approach. It's not an either-or. And it's not only that it's not an either-or, and we have to look at the colonial, and we have to also look at regional, national, and local factors. But as you said, I'm also recognize that anything local, national, and regional is also constituted through the global. So it is a dialectic. So absolutely, but unfortunately, it is often, I mean, the approach is often very dichotomous. So I totally agree with you. I would also like to stress, I don't think there is a post-colonial approach. Okay, I think there are lots of different approaches. And I mean, I think of myself also as a post-colonial feminist, transnational feminist scholar. I think a lot has to do with positionality. I mean, I do think that in the UK we have a bit more wriggle room than when you're based in New York or somewhere else in the States, especially right now, although I have to say here the spaces are shrinking by the minute. But, you know, I always, every time I go to the States or conference, I do feel how I'm become much more defensive and I'm reacting to you know, switching on the television and seeing Trump and others speak. So it's, I think, there is, I wouldn't want to generalize post-colonial feminism. I also think there's a specific post-structuralist strand within that. And I think that the other strand that I've identified is the one, probably the Assadian trend, which is, you know, speaking about, I feel the scholarship, so I'm thinking here, Talal Assad, Sabah Mahmoud, and derivatives, where the scholarship is really, and we had a sort of really interesting debate recently in the Middle East Studies group, the scholarship is really more about a critique of Western liberalism and Western enlightenment, and that's kind of the target. And it's not really engaging with local, complex, empirical realities. And I think that's also, I find that in some of the scholarship that is really much more targeting Western liberal discourse rather than really being grounded in complex realities. But I totally agree, we cannot avoid the colonial, you know, so that's not my intention at all. In terms of Isabel's question, absolutely, there is a tension, but I think it's not an unsurmountable tension. So in the article that I recently published, I referred to Denise Candiotti's very useful analytical distinction between different forms of gender-based violence in the context of Afghanistan. And I think when she makes a distinction between the more privatized form of gender-based violence happening, within the family, let's say, and then the kind of more systematic structural violence as part of, the conflict with the state. And then she speaks about Taliban, and she says what is unique about gender-based violence with respect to the Taliban is that it is doctrinally justified. Okay, and I think that's, of course, a big issue with respect to ISIS and Daesh as well. So I think we should be equipped academically, conceptually, and politically to point to the new layers and specific atrocities, linked to an organization that justifies the enslavement of women, the systematic dehumanization. I mean, thinking particularly, of course, of Yazidi women who have a magazine, a glossy, online magazine in English, where evidently, female members of Daesh provide different verses to justify this. And it's not, obviously, that's kind of the PR machine. And then there is, one of the things that I found so objectionable in terms of description of, how people die through ISIS. Most people don't just die in one elegant stroke. So there are lots of different ways. But I think it is possible to point out the specific and the level of atrocities without, while recognizing that they don't exist in a vacuum, okay? That there's a whole continuum. There's a whole continuum, and in the context of Iraq, there's a whole history of turning a blind eye to gender-based violence. And there's a whole history of instrumentalizing gender-based violence. And in the article, I write about the fact that, of course, let's take the Ba'ath regime, okay? In the Anfal campaign against Kurds in Iraq, where it wasn't only that the regime used chemical weapons, there was also systematic rape of Kurdish women. Do you think the British government was interested in it when Kurdish and Iraqi women were campaigning? They were not interested. Now, the moment 9/11 happened, all of a sudden, you have Blair being interested in it. Okay? So it's this instrumentalization of violence, and that cuts across. It's not just with IS. And in relation to Iraq, precisely, when Daesh first appeared on the scene in Iraq in 2014, it was very much instrumentalized also inside Iraq in terms of sectarian narratives. So it was a way, for Shia to say, look how horrible. I'm simplifying this. It was also justifying certain forms of Shia sectarianism and governance, and that's continuing to today. So I think it is possible to really, look, and there are people, who, it's very difficult, of course, to do empirical research, but some people do, especially in, southern Kurdistan, amongst also Yazidi women who returned. And okay, now in terms of the question about, yes, so recently, I think it was like a week ago or so, we were told that now ISIS Daesh is going to employ women as fighters as well. I think, my interpretation is that in many ways they're responding to, the fact that in terms of PR, the Kurdish political movement is, doing a much, doing much better in that sense. I think they're realizing that women are key to it. I don't think that women have just been involved I do think that women have been involved in many different ways. Women are very much part of the whole enslavement operation. They are playing a very active role in dehumanizing other women. But we'll see in terms of, it would not be unique. If you look at Hamas, for example, or other organizations, you know, women start to get involved either as suicide bombers or as fighters.
Thank you very much.
Just very quickly on the point. Few people, if not almost nobody, you know, like has been there to do actual field work, etc. in Iraq was, and is still, I feel, and I think I'm quite emotional when I feel this way among, for example, you know, leftist, anti-imperialist kind of, you know, activists here. Iraq is a topic. Is a topic. So okay, you're coming to talk about Iraq, so you're gonna tell us stuff about imperialism. You're gonna tell us stuff about how America has destroyed your country. This is what we want to hear. And interestingly also, because we launched like a collective recently composed of many Iraqis living outside Iraq. And I also often, you know, have this feeling that people are not always interested of what is actually concretely going on, but are only interested in nurturing a kind of narrative. And I think, and this is what I'm promoting my PhD, because this is what I said in my conclusion, is like in order to you know, approach this issue in a way that is, let's say, decolonial, but really decolonial is to be very, very close to people's realities and the, you know, the multi-layered aspects of their realities. And actually, when I started my fieldwork in 2010, I was, you know, relying on the literature, and there were very few stuff about what was actually going on inside Iraq. And so when I was preparing like my interviews question, I wanted to talk with Iraqi women's activists in Baghdad about, okay, so you know, about imperialism and stuff, and I quickly realized that people actually in 2010 wanted to build something. They wanted to talk about other things. Which doesn't mean that in my analysis I will put aside the fact that these other things that they want to talk about has been structured by, you know, imperialism and colonialism, but still things are going on as well and being organized. So to give a concrete example, we often say among the literature, among the activists, you know, NGOs are like neoliberal kind of and neocolonial politics in the Middle East, the way NGOs, you know, the gender mainstreaming campaigns and stuff like that, that are imposed, you know, as like a package and apply, you know, all over the Middle East. And I mean, in the Iraqi context, what I found really interesting is that in this situation of, you know, complete chaos and you know, institutionalization of sectarianism, etc. Yes, this and you know, this structural situation caused by imperialism and many other things. Actually, the space opened by NGOs, because the state is so weak, because the state is so corrupted and sectarian, were the only and very few spaces where women activists could actually define themselves outside the sectarian and identity politics. Could be just women's rights activists and not only Kurdish activists or Sunni feminists or Sunni women's rights activists or Shia women's rights activists. So we see that it's more complex than that, it's more nuanced than that. Of course, like we have to acknowledge the, you know, hegemonic and let's say the superstructures, but looking at the very way it is concretely deployed and how people are actually navigating with these, within this, is also respecting them and respecting what they're doing and not reducing everything to, yeah, so it's people now are in Tahrir Square because they are against this regime imposed by Al-American. Yes, true, but they are also, you know, willing to build something in the post-invasion era, and I think it's very important to respect that.
Well, I don't have much to add, but I totally agree with Nadia and all the rest that the local complexities and the empirical reality should be taken into consideration when we examine the reality, especially in relation to gender in the Middle East. And one thing that should be mentioned in relation to Daesh is that the different forms of violence practiced by Daesh, including the sexual violence, rape, and sexual slavery, naming them against the Yazidi women, these have been used as war tactics, as war strategies. And I wonder whether now, since they declared that women within Daesh are going to become fighters, whether this is not part of their war strategies, rather than, of course, drawing parallel with the PKK or Kurdish female fighters. And it's very deeply rooted into the structure of the party. It's very different from what the ISIS is trying to do.
Thank you. I think one of the things about this panel, unlike some other panels that we had in this series, that everybody seems to agree with each other. Which I think...
Unusual among women.
No, it's not unusual, but it is... It just shows that although the particular foci of each kind of analysis is different, there are some generalities. I just want to highlight, I think, 2 or 3 things that for me come up. Nadia mentioned the word positionality, which for me is very much associated with intersectional analysis. And this was implicit in the analysis of all the members of the panel against dichotomies, looking at the situated gazes, both in terms of the particular society, but also dehomogenizing women and men and political projects, because there are different positionalities in which their participation in the particular political projects that we talked about is being constructed locally, regionally, and globally. The other issue is that I think very important to differentiate when we talk about gender-based violence, but generally in terms of gender relations that were mentioned here, is between the actual gender division of labor as we see it evolving throughout the invasion, the resistance, and so on, and the symbolic role of these gender relations, and particularly the symbolic role of women as fulfilling particular roles in the national ethnic religious project. So you mentioned it as a kind of military or war strategy, but I think it's really part of the overall construction and representation of the political project. And even when we talk not about Daesh, but we are talking about the Kurdish fighting in the Rojava, one of the things that interests me when we discuss this kind of issue is that people talk about the transformation of the gender role of women, but they don't talk about the transformation and gender role of men. They don't interrelate the two, and this is why they're very transitory, very fragile, and the minute this particular phase in the national or religious or political struggle is a kind of change, these things are not sustainable and are not harmonic. And I think maybe in the next round, if you want to comment on also in relation to this. Now we are open to the next. Yes.
Yeah, well, I wanted to take up something that I think all of the speakers mentioned, but in particular Nadia and Ruba, and that is the question of an anti-imperialist outlook failing to recognize the agency of women in their own struggles. And Ruba talked about, I just wanted to give a little case study or a little example, Ruba, because it's been extremely difficult, as you all know, partly through Assad misinformation, and partly through actually the role of the left, the anti-imperialist left, for either men or women, Syrian men or women, civilians, to get their voices heard at all in the West, against the cacophony of voices saying, you know, don't bomb Syria, hands off, take your hands off, don't do anything. Or, well, maybe it's all right to bomb ISIS, but not anyone else. But the women of Daraya, which is a city very close to Damascus, on the 5th of April, gathered around their local women's centre. And I'm glad you mentioned the role of NGOs, because a lot of the most fantastic, brilliant Syrian women I've met are actually working in NGOs. They had to flee for their lives, but they went back, or they worked with people on the ground through the role of NGOs. And Ruba can speak a lot more about that than I can. Anyway, the women of Daraya gathered around their local women's centre, Women Now Development, run by, and issued a desperate call for help to the world after having a series of demonstrations against the siege which was starving the townspeople there. And in fact, in one of their demonstrations, I thought was really hilarious, they carried, we didn't dare reproduce it this morning on our demonstration actually, because they produced an ISIS picture and they said, look, will you see that? Yeah. If we show you that, will you see that? We're starving. It's not ISIS, it's Assad that's starving us. And so on. And one of the things that we did in Voices from Women Over March was an organisation called, we pulled together a coalition of women to answer that call. And it was brilliant actually. Several black sisters, bless their souls, who were attuned to this form of violence against women, to have people starving, to have women and children starving in towns. They picked up on it and signed it. Women in Black signed it. There was a whole constellation of Syrian organisations that signed it. And we had a demonstration this morning, which was a culmination of that background work. Joe Cox asked for airdrops in Parliament a couple of weeks ago. But I'm afraid the world, the media, is deaf to that, is deaf to those cries. Women have actually responded far better than the left to those kind of calls for solidarity. And in fact, we were so desperate this morning because we thought, this demonstration, nobody's going to notice it. So we actually chucked bread rolls over the gates of Downing Street, risking arrest, but managing to avoid it, just in order to say, look, you know, we are acting in solidarity with women who are the leaders in their community. Civilian women in Syria are amazing. They produce documentaries, they speak, they ask for solidarity, and they are not heard. And I'm afraid the whole anti-imperialist approach, i.e. my enemy's enemy is my friend. And the whole kind of like, oh, if Obama likes it, then we're definitely against it. And Assad is kind of okay because Obama doesn't like him. That's simplistic, juvenile, infantile, anti-imperialism. It's time that we ditched it and listened to women in struggle and stood beside them and listened to their voices of solidarity.
Thank you very much. Yes.
I had a kind of a, not really a question, but kind of a thought that I would really love to hear your opinions on. So I come more from the practitioner side, and as you know, obviously there's so much focus on ISIS and a lot of focus on extremism, fundamentalism, radicalism, whatever you want to call it. And I am, and a lot of other people, obviously very concerned that whenever gender is brought into the discussion, you know, usually it's like add on, okay, what does this mean with gender? It's usually how can we use women to, you know, have less radical people out there. And unfortunately, I mean, it's a debate that hasn't, at least I feel, hasn't really happened yet. Like, how do we speak more constructively and comprehensively of gender in relation to these issues? So I'm not sure. I mean, I'm kind of venting my frustration, but I would love to hear like how you think we could really bring in gender in a more comprehensive way. So you mentioned, Zahra, for example, I mean, masculinity and, you know, masculine space. I mean, these kind of elements that whenever, you know, studies are done on gender and extremism, it's always, you know, also very, or at least often kind of they try and focus narrowly on SGBV or, you know, Yazidi women. And obviously this has to be spoken about and written about, but, you know, what about talking, for example, about ideologies, or, I mean, I really think masculinity is missing in there, in a lot of the discussions, but also other things like gender norms, kind of, and the history, which we've already addressed, but I'd love to hear kind of your opinion on this.
Okay. There are quite 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have one more now and the others for the next round.
Just building on that, I just wanted to hear about how, as a feminist, you look at Islam particularly, and about Islam particularly, and the role of how feminists not translated Islam, but there is a lot of feminist movements now trying to look at modern Islam and how it's used in a legal framework post-war. How does that connect? Does it make the issue better? Because it's really important as academics at the end of the day to have a movement that reach the local people and make them engage with us. And if in other countries like Sudan, we have been under 27 years of Sharia, if we look at when we gain our independence again, we will not be able to separate completely, but we still have to look at something with that media and also encompass other religions, including tribal religion. So how about that?
Okay. Why don't this time Rupa start?
2 points about what she's doing. Like, I wish she was here and she could speak, but as she's not here, I'm gonna speak for her. But I mean, first, the fact that it's not like being let's say a humanitarian activist or being somebody who approaches things in a more scholarly way and being very intersectional. I mean, Maria is very much involved, on the ground, and she's traveling around all the different women center set up by women now all over the region. But she tries as much as she can to be as intersectional as she can. And she tries as much as she can not to put aside too much her activist, anti-imperialist kind, feminist, leftist kind of activism, which is her background. When we met a few years ago, we met, through these struggles, and then the situation in Syria happened, and she got involved. So some women are or many women are actually trying to do both at the same time. But of course, I mean, the reality on the ground is so there are matters of urgency. So sometimes you do have to put, and Maria says it. Sometimes I do have to put some of my intersectional feminist belief on the side and just deal with urgent matters. And actually, in terms of issues of men and masculinity, I mean, some centers in Women Now actually propose activities and propose also psychological support to young men as well, because they also realize that, just like you said very rightly and strongly, that it's not possible to go on just considering one half of the society without the other, and it's a general struggle for the whole future of Syrian society to implement men and to propose activities to men and young men in particular. Then I will talk about the issues of Islam and stuff. I mean, it was the first abstract that I submitted. It's in the flyer, so I feel really obliged to speak about that. I mean, I have identified, to be very brief, 4 forms of feminist activism in Iraq. Let's say the first would be the human rights feminist. So the ones who articulate the advocacy for women's rights through these women rights NGOs kind of discourse. Within these human rights feminism, there is the second category, which would be it's hard to use the term Muslim feminist, but I do use it in my research because it's not comparable to the kind of Muslim feminism that you see in the West, that is also directed towards a struggle against Islamophobia. I mean, in Iraq it's more imbricated to women who are involved in NGOs and who are also personally trying to articulate a reflection within the religious frame. But then, even if they want to articulate a reflection within the religious frame, you have Sunni fiqh and you have Shia fiqh. So what these two kinds, or let's say most women's rights activists in Iraq are trying to do, is to actually have a reflection, insist on the fact that we should preserve the personal status code, the unified personal status code that is based upon Sharia and upon Sunni and Shia jurisprudence, in order to preserve, at least, even if this personal status code is not perfect, and even if very few women's rights activists in Iraq, even among the most radical, would actually go back and say we have to have equality in inheritance, like we had it, between 1959 and 1963, so only for 4 or 5 years, but still. Most of women's rights activists, whatever their perception of Islam and their relationship to Islam, whether they want to approach the issue in a more secular way, whether they want to go into the religious debate, would agree on let's preserve this code make it sure for us that we have these essential rights. Now there are also Islamist women. Some I would consider as feminists, but as contradictory feminists, because they are women of party, and I mean women of conservative party. So even though some of them are actually, some of them are also members of the Iraqi Women's Network, which is the main network gathering women's rights activists in Iraq, across a very diverse spectrum. But they can be contradictory in the sense that, for example, when there was the issue of the Article 41 of the Constitution, or the decree, for the Shia Islamist women, some of them, or many of them, most of them followed the line of the Shia Islamist party, rather than put aside the feminist convictions when it comes to defend the Shia identity, the Shia Islamist identity. And then the fourth, and interestingly, and this is something I wanted to talk about, but I couldn't because of time. Interestingly, Sunni Islamist women in Iraq are very close to a kind of, let's say, secular feminist discourse, in the sense that they would insist on preserving the personal status code, because now it's the only way for them to have their rights as Sunni Muslim women respected. So this is an element. And then the fourth category, very quickly, are, let's say, the radical and leftist feminists who exist. I mean, they exist in Iraq, but they are mostly completely, let's say, marginalized. And some women in Iraq, some women's rights activists who would say privately that they would advocate for complete secularization of the personal status code, would hardly be able to say it publicly because of the tensions.
Thank you very much. Okay, so just a general comment. I mean, the fact that men started to become jealous because funds are directed to women's activities and women's rights. It's actually, I don't see this as in a positive way, because most of these aids are focusing on the in a kind of anthropological approach, focusing on the oppression and victimhood of women, on the suffering of women. So women are not treated as active agents. The resistance of women is not addressed. And I mean, I have a lot of problem with that kind of anthropological approach, always, looking at the victimhood rather than the active agents, or women as actors. And that created, of course, a division between men and women. And in a way, marginalized women in a kind of subjective position, rather than as resistant actors trying to transform their immediate life. They become very dependent on these foreign aids. And the other thing, within these women's NGOs or women's groups, there's something very important that we discuss in relation to the political parties, sexuality. This is not addressed within women's NGOs in that part. Most of the women's NGOs, if not all, in the Middle East, they don't address sexuality. And this is a major problem for them because they have been reproducing the traditional gender norms and always trying just to go around their victim position. And they haven't been able to make any progress. Just a quick comment on Islam. I agree with you. I mean, all these details are very important, but there's a very simple element. I mean, for me, all the three monotheist religions are interrelated. One is born out of the other. There isn't much difference. Of course, you have cultural and historical specificities, but you know, they are all patriarchals and not progressive towards women. The thing is about Islam is when we look at it from a socialist point of view, we come up with the discourse, the dominant discourse that we hear nowadays. But if we look at Islam, I very much like Fatima Mernis's approach towards Islam is that, you know, trying to look at it in they've been looking at it as a historical text. The Quran is, you know, being dealt with in a historical way. Just put it in the context of history, and then it will be developed like any other things, and we will not end up, you know, in the position now we are now in. It's as simple as that. But of course, it hasn't been dealt with in that historical.
Can I just say something? You know, just in.
Can you keep it for the next one, because we are starting to get, and we want one more round, at least 4 people.
Okay,
who
so
are,
I'll keep it.
Nadia, and then. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm going to now disagree with one of my panelists. I have quite a different take on the victim. This, for a long time, there was a sort of literature of misery, you know, the sort of oppressed women. And then I would say, though, the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years, it's the opposite. There's this sort of agency. So I think we really need to distinguish if we look at sort of scholarship or we look at media policy discourses. I agree with you in terms of media policy discourses. That is a very strong narrative, but not within the scholarship. I think for me, it's the opposite. And I really think I tend to agree that we need to take the issue of man and masculinities very seriously. I think that Denise Candiotti's conceptualization of her having moved away from the idea of patriarchal bargain and now telling this idea of masculinist restoration, I think it's a really powerful analytical tool to understand that it's not anymore patriarchy as usual, because, you know, women have made lots of achievements and they're involved at so many different levels. But of course the backlash against that is very strong. But I think what she points out, yes, in the context of Egypt, maybe, and Tunisia, but I think I see it as well, definitely in the context of Turkey and the Kurdish political movement, and I would be interested also to hear from Zahra and Ruba about Syria and Iraq more broadly, and you know, sort of population more broadly, and that for the political elite, I think men, you know, they would sort of say the right things, and they were very much put under pressure. I mean, it was actually, it's like, my problem is that it seems to be this slightly kind of very intensive.
Most of the people who has been, you know, victimized were the well-known activists, political figures. And in the end, you said usually 82% of them not very educated people. Now we have a dilemma. These well-known people are no education, or, you know, could you explain more details about this one? The second one, you said about vulnerability. You said no education creates, you know, vulnerable personality as a no education. You bring together this often. But also there are concepts, especially Kurdish community, the people who are educated are given too much responsibility from families. expectations from the community actually put them in the vulnerable position more. For this, how can we, describe no education as a vulnerable? There is this connection between these one.
Thank you very much.
The last comment, just
the last comment, but in a couple of sentences, yeah.
And in addition of the Nadia's comment, actually, we in Diyarbakir, when we interview people, the transformation of man, the Gülten Kışanak, the co-mayor of Diyarbakir, she said, I am a mayor, I can be welcomed by societies, different places, but still as a woman, I'm not, actually. I'm not allowed to enter places. Even though HDP, the Kurdish, mainly Kurdish party, but also Turkish leftist part of that party, have an agenda, any man should have a gender study before applying the member of the party, and polygamy or any violence against women, the member cannot, these people cannot be accepted to be member as well.
That's good, the political economy, a lot of new jobs. That's good.
Yeah, hi, my name is Raja. I had a question specifically for Dr. Beghani, because I also work on Iraqi Kurdistan or Iraqi Kurdish women. I just had some questions for you about the sort of recent development and sort of like the exacerbation of the position of women. And I know when you started doing more and more projects with the Kurdish regional government in 2008, things were looking hopeful, and I remember meeting you at the time, and there were changes happening, and with the amendment to the personal status law. And obviously the financial crisis, and now IS being at the doorstep, and sort of also the leadership becoming more and more authoritarian. Is there a way to stop the kind of damage that's being done every day now? And if not, what do you suggest is a way to sort of reverse it and sort of back up? And it's open to anyone to answer.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Hi, my question is for Ruba and Zahra. So I'm wondering if you ladies can tell us a bit more about the fieldwork itself. So I'm really interested in hearing about the actual activisms of the women that you witnessed. What were their key challenges? What were your reflections as feminists, as women, as Muslim women, as insiders of that community? And also a bigger question, I don't know if you can answer it, what role, if any, do you see these activisms playing in any future peace and reconciliation process?
And last question.
Hi, thanks for the great discussions. My question is kind of not happening in this situation, but very related to this situation. It's about the experiences of British Muslim girls in secondary schools right now in Britain. And I'm wondering if you have any, because I'm a PhD student, I'm working on that, and I'm wondering if you have any insights about that, how the situation in Middle East kind of brings some consequences for the Muslim girls here within this country, and yes.
Yeah.
Do you see it as a gender-based violence, or kind of targeting them, being at the risk, or risky, vulnerable girls?
Thank you. The previous seminar last term was about the Prevent Agenda, and you can watch it on the CMRP and also the studies because we videoed it. So I think, Nazan, you should start now, because a couple of the questions were specific to you, and then Ruba, and then Nara, and Nadia, you have the last word.
Yeah, and I
try only at about 3 minutes each,
I'd like to be short. Latif also asked a question about who are these private actors practicing violence against women. After I presented my speech, I'd like also to answer this question. In the piece of research that I presented, I mentioned a sample just from Soleimani between January to August 2015. Within that sample, the majority of women who were targeted by the cyber violence were vulnerable, not very well educated women. But generally, the research findings show that well-known female figures within Kurdish communities, and by well-known I mean women's rights activists, MPs, journalists, TV presenters, they are mainly targeted by these kinds of violence. Even women's politicians. It's very much about power relations. And coming back to your first question after my presentation, actually my findings show that some of this violence have been practiced by women. For example, we have a case study of an MP whose footage was circulated through mobile phones and later on the internet. It was a pornographic footage. And that started when she split from the PUK and joined Goran. If you are familiar with the political context of Kurdistan, you know what I mean. And I interviewed her several times, and she was certain that it was done by a woman within the PUK, a female activist within the PUK, a very well-known female activist. So yes, it's some women also reproducing these patriarchal mentalities and use it against women. As for, actually I didn't understand your second question, I'm so sorry.
Or maybe after the meeting you can discuss more.
The other is about Haja, is that your name, Haja?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, you're right. I mean, when we started in Iraqi Kurdistan, all our focus were addressed at violence against women and honor-based violence. I mean, in 2002, we started this pioneering piece of research into honor-based violence funded by the Kurdistan Regional Government, led by Emeritus Professor Jill Haig, who is here, led by Bristol. But now that the financial situation is very different, now that we have ISIS on our borders and Peshmerga are fighting. I was in Kurdistan just 3 weeks ago, and we, by we I mean women's rights activists in that part of Kurdistan, started developing gender studies centers within universities in Kurdistan. And this is a shift. This is a shift because we are trying to move from violence against women and honor-based violence and looking at other aspects and other issues concerning women and society in general in Kurdistan. And instead of just focusing on activism, trying to link activism with academia and scholarship.
Thank you.
Yeah, just very briefly, cyber attacks.
Just like behind you, who she's a PhD here and she's finishing a study about that, so you can speak to her. About my fieldwork generally, I mean, I would have a lot of things to say. Just a point to reflect on my very recent fieldwork, like 3 weeks ago, is like the fact that women were not very present in Tahrir Square. But they were still present, and some women's rights activists in a shabaka, in the Iraqi Women's Network, or generally were actually insisting on the link, because the debate actually in Sahat al-Tahrir is the involvement of Muqtada Sadr within the whole popular movement, and the fact that many people feel that some people would feel that it's an instrumentalization by a very powerful and hegemonic Islamist party of a very popular grassroots kind of activism. And some other would see it, and I mean, women's rights activists were very divided, as all civil society activists. Some others would see it as, well, it arrived at the right time because people were actually going home, because it's been months and months that they were going every Friday in the square. And interestingly, somebody who is the head of LML organization, also a founding member of the Iraqi Women's Network, has had a very nuanced kind of approach. So her name is Hena Edwar, and she and a delegation of women's rights activists, they went to the tents because activists were organizing sit-in in front of the main doors of the green zone, you know, to protest and ask for a radical change of politics. And this delegation of women went there and said, like, we have to link these like demands for social equality and the end of sectarianism to gender equality, and we have to basically work together.
Thank you very much.
Well, just 2 points. Well, I don't know about that, but I think that I feel uncomfortable with. I haven't done research on Muslim girls in British schools, so British Muslim girls, but I feel uncomfortable with the question because how do you know? I mean, which kind of British Muslim girl are you talking about? Bosnian, a Kurd? I mean, does she, in which way Muslim? I mean, I think we have to be careful when we construct the British Muslim girl. I think you could have 50 girls in a room and probably half of them are Muslim and you might not identify because maybe you identify them just through wearing hijab, which I think is problematic. So just, you know, it's a sort of short. I just wanted to very quickly, following on Haj's question to Nazant, and I think it's a wider point we didn't discuss here, but it is an issue when we think about feminist strategies at this specific historical moment, but also historically, which is how do we, what are our sort of channels and mechanisms, what are our alliances, and how do we work with the state in whichever form or shape. And I think historically there is a you know, we are dealing with a situation where feminists in the region often allied themselves with authoritarian regimes. And I think, I personally feel that it's very easy for us to, you know, be very critical about that sitting here in London. I think that, you know, if spaces are opening up, I mean, I can understand that, you know, we want to grab it. But I think there is also some of the backlash we see right now in some countries in the region is because of this, well, co-option of some feminists. I'm thinking particularly in terms of Tunisia and Egypt, but of course it happened in other contexts. And so, you know, in I mean, if you look at the Kurdish regional government, I mean, I know that at some point spaces seem to be opening up, but I mean, we haven't had that conversation, but now it's very different, and I think feminists are really challenged, you know, to decide, you know, at which point is it okay to, at least on certain issues, collaborate with regimes that are, you know, potentially authoritarian, and where's our red line? And I think that's a discussion, you know, that's happening actually everywhere in the region.
Yeah, this is a discussion that cannot be in the abstract. It has to be
exactly,
in any
the
kind of
specific
interaction with a particular spatial and temporal context that dealing with it. This has been absolutely fascinating discussion, and can we all thank all the speakers and the discussion. We usually go to the bar in the Russell Hotel to